Hello, this is Justin, and this is a book review and summary of Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion by Robert B. Cialdini. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and click the bell notifications. I put up book reviews and summaries of great books. The reason why I started this channel is because I love reading and I like to inspire people to read, and I like to talk about what I read. And personally for me, I get bored very easily when watching TV or movies, and usually within 10 minutes I get bored and I just end up reading a great book. Not all the time, some movies and films I do like, but usually I prefer reading books, and I find reading a very stimulating activity that you can learn a lot from. So I want to inspire more people to read and to talk about great books that I read. The book Influence revolves around the 6 weapons of influence, which are reciprocation, commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. Before we get into the details of the 6 weapons of influence, we should look at how animals behave in the wild. A lot of animals automatically respond to certain triggers or stimuli. One fascinating example the book uses is the female turkey. When turkey chicks make a cheep cheep noise, the female turkey would automatically embrace it and start nurturing them. And when the chicks don't make that noise, the female turkey would ignore it or sometimes kill it. So not being able to make the cheep cheep noise would be a birth defect in baby turkey chicks. An experiment done with polecats found that a stuffed polecat with a recorder inserted inside making cheep cheep noises can actually get the female turkey to embrace it and nurture it, even though the polecat is the turkey's arch enemy. And this is fascinating because it goes to show how one single trigger can get a female turkey to act in a certain way. And when that cheep cheep noise was turned off in the polecat, the female turkey attacked the polecat and tried to tear it to pieces. This example shows how animals react automatically to certain triggers, and we shouldn't think that only lower animals do that, because humans do that as well, although to a lesser extent. Even though humans have the capability of conscious thinking, we aren't consciously thinking all the time, and sometimes we just respond automatically. And these 6 weapons of influence are stimuli that cause us to respond in a certain way. Now, before we get into the 6 weapons of influence, one more thing I would like to say is that self-interest is not included as one of the principles of influence, and that is not because the author thinks that self-interest is not important. On the contrary, he thinks that it's so obvious that he does not have to explain it. The first principle of influence is reciprocation. Humans generally repay favors with favors and retaliate against insults and threats with insults and threats. This is pervasive throughout every human society. In fact, sociologists have not found a single human society where reciprocation was not the norm. I personally think that reciprocation is ingrained into human nature and it's part of our psyche. Cialdini also talks about reciprocal concessions, which is a strategy where when 2 parties negotiate, one party can concede and the other party is more willing to concede. And in fact, reciprocal concessions actually create greater positive feeling and greater commitment to the final deal. The second principle of influence is commitment and consistency. Humans have the tendency to be consistent with what they commit to, and generally this is a very good thing. I think the best example Cialdini uses to illustrate this principle is the blanket experiment, where a researcher went to a beach to pretend to sunbathe. The researcher would leave his blanket 5 feet away from a randomly chosen individual, and when the researcher left, his accomplice would try to steal the blanket, and the objective was to see how many subjects would actually intervene to stop the theft. Now, when the researcher left, sometimes he would ask the subject to watch his things, sometimes he wouldn't say a word. Of the instances where he left without saying a word, 20% of the subjects intervened to stop the theft. However, when the researcher left after asking the subject to watch his things, 95% of the subjects intervened to stop the theft. This shows how powerful the act of committing to a request can be, because it shows that a lot more people were willing to stop the theft after they committed to accepting the request made by the researcher to watch his things. 2 more points about commitment and consistency. One is that commitments made in public are much stronger commitments. The other is that commitments made with an investment of effort are also much stronger commitments. One example would be fraternity pledging. When new fraternity brothers try to join a fraternity, they go through a pledging process, which involves a lot of trials and ordeals. And through that process, they invest great effort to get into that fraternity. So when they actually get into that fraternity, they are much more committed because it took them a lot of effort just to get in. The third principle of influence is social proof. People have the tendency to imitate others, especially when they are in doubt or uncertain with what to do. They'll look to others to figure out what to do. A major example Cialdini uses to illustrate the power of social proof is canned laughter. Even though when we watch a comedy and hear canned laughter, we know it's fake, but canned laughter does work in actually making us perceive scenes as funnier than they would actually be. And a lot of studies have shown that that is actually the case. Social proof is so powerful it can actually cure the fear of dogs and social anxiety. When psychologists were working with children with a fear of dogs, they would show them clips of children of the same age playing with dogs. As a result, the children would actually become less fearful of dogs and started playing with dogs in a more frequent basis. Psychologists working with socially withdrawn children also did something similar. They showed them clips of children of a similar age, usually isolated children by themselves, joining into ongoing social activity to everyone's pleasure. As the children watched the clips, they actually became less withdrawn, and afterwards it was observed that they were as sociable as their peers after the psychologists have showed them the clips. And that just shows how powerful social proof is as people imitate the behavior of similar others. A very important thing about social proof is that it works best when we are observing similar others. And I think the wallet experiment done in Midtown Manhattan best shows this point. So in the wallet experiment, drop wallets were placed around Manhattan, all containing the same amount of money with the contact details of the wallet's owner and a letter that looked like it was written by a previous person who found the wallet and intended to return it to the wallet's original owner. Some of the letters were written in standard English to imply that the writer was American, while others were written in broken English to imply that the writer was a foreigner. The result was striking. Only 33% of the wallets were returned when the first finder was seen as dissimilar, but fully 70% were returned when the writer was thought to be a similar other. The fourth principle of influence is liking. It should go without saying that we are more receptive to people we like. Cialdini talks about the characteristics that contribute to the likability of an individual. They are physical attractiveness, similarity, compliments, contact and cooperation, and conditioning and association. Physical attractiveness, similarity, and compliments are pretty straightforward and obvious. In regards to contact and cooperation, yes, we are more receptive to people and things we are more familiar with and have more contact with, but not always. When we have contact with people or things in a negative context, we can actually grow to dislike or even hate them. A great experiment done to demonstrate this phenomenon is the Robbers Cave experiment, which was an experiment done at a boys' summer camp. The boys were divided into 2 different groups, and the researchers decided to first introduce competitive activities. When that happened, the boys began to really hate each other and rivalries grew. There were a lot of physical fights, name-calling, cabin raids, and theft, and generally speaking, the boys hated the other group. Later, the researchers wanted to resolve this conflict, so they introduced more neutral activities like watching movies together or having picnics. This did not work at all because the boys continued to fight during these activities and call each other names. However, the researchers were able to fix the conflict when they forced the boys to cooperate. They would introduce activities that the boys would have to come together and all cooperate to fix them. For example, they would get a truck stuck in the camp and all the boys had to work together to get it unstuck. Another example is they would shut down the camp water supply, and that would force the boys to cooperate to fix the water supply. As a result, as more cooperative activities were introduced, the boys began to resolve their conflicts and actually grew to like each other. And at the end of the summer camp, the boys made friends with boys from the other group as well as their own group, which goes to show how powerful cooperation is when it is used with greater contact. The other characteristic of liking is conditioning and association. This is about the fact that we associate people with whatever situation or feeling they give us. So one example is that the book uses is Persian messengers. Back in ancient Persia, Persian messengers would bring back battlefield news back home. And when the news was good, the messenger was rewarded with food and wine and a great feast, and everyone was very kind to the messenger. However, when the battlefield news was bad, the messenger was often executed, even though he had nothing to do with the battlefield results. And this just goes to show that people really associate each other with the feelings they give them, even though they are not responsible for these feelings. Another example are weathermen. A lot of you don't know that a lot of weathermen and weather reporters get a lot of hate mail whenever there's bad weather, even though they did not cause the bad weather. And when the weather is good again, and the weatherman or weatherwoman announces the good weather, people are a lot nicer, even though the weather person did not even cause the weather. And this is because we associate a person with the feelings they give us, whether or not they actually cause those feelings. The fifth principle of influence is authority. People have the tendency to obey figures of authority, and if this was not true, it would be very difficult to build complex societies governed by law and order. I think the most jarring example that Cialdini uses to illustrate the power of authority is the milligram experiment. In this experiment, a volunteer subject would go into a room and see a researcher dressed in a white lab coat with another subject. The researcher would tell the subject that he or she was participating in an experiment about the effects of punishment on memory learning. Afterwards, one of the subjects would be assigned the role of learner and the other subject would be assigned the role of teacher. The subject assigned the role of learner would be responsible for learning a list of pairs of words, and then the subject assigned to the role of teacher would test the subject's memorization and administer electric shocks whenever the other subject got it wrong. The learner would be strapped to a chair and attached to electrodes, while the teacher would be in the other room administering increasingly strong electric shocks whenever the learner would get something wrong. What the subject assigned the role of teacher did not know was that the learner was actually not a subject. The learner was actually an accomplice to the researcher, and there would actually be no electric shocks given. However, the learner was supposed to act like the electric shocks were getting increasingly painful and to kick the wall, to cry out, to scream, and eventually to cry for mercy and ask for the experiment to stop. The researcher, however, would continue to order the teacher to continue administering increasingly strong electric shocks, and the objective of the study was to see how many teachers would actually do that and how many would actually stop. The results were very unsettling. 2/3 of the subjects pulled every single switch they were ordered to and did not stop until the researcher personally ended the experiment. In the first set of experiments with 40 subjects, not a single one stopped when the learner first cried for the experiment to stop. Also, they didn't stop until 300 volts was reached, and the ones that did stop after that were a minority. Because the first set of experiments with 40 subjects were all male, a lot of other psychologists and researchers were wondering if the same results could be repeated with different demographics. So Milgram conducted the same experiment multiple times varying the different demographics, and they gave the same results. This shows how powerful the influence of authority is on many people and how it could influence our behaviors. Additionally, Cialdini talks about the symbols of authority and how we tend to obey these symbols. And these symbols are titles, such as doctor or professor, clothes, especially business suits and uniforms, and trappings like jewelry and expensive cars. The sixth and last principle of influence is scarcity. Now, this was the hardest one for me to understand and the least intuitive for me, because I, as a person, usually judge things by their inherent value. But Cialdini did show that scarcity does play a role in human desire, and unconsciously, scarcity might have an effect on me. I have no idea, but it definitely does on other people, because Cialdini himself was affected by the principle of scarcity. One time, his neighborhood Mormon temple was recently renovated. Now, Mormon temples are usually pretty restricted. The intersection is very closed and private, and no one outside faithful members can actually enter. Even potential converts are not allowed to enter the intersection of a Mormon temple. However, when a Mormon temple is newly built or newly renovated, the entire structure is open to the public. And Cialdini wanted to see the intersection because he would know that that was his only chance to see the intersection before it was forever closed to outsiders. But he soon realized that he had no interest in Mormonism and no interest in the architecture of Mormon temples, which he thinks would be very similar to the architecture of a cathedral or a church, which he can go to any time. The only reason he actually wanted to visit the Mormon temple is because he knew that that was the only chance he got to see the intersection before he was not allowed to see the intersection forever. And this is the principle of scarcity in action. And this is also why a lot of people pay ridiculous amounts of money for rare items, even though the inherent value for these items is probably not that great. I am currently rereading the biography of Steve Jobs, and I read that the old Apple II, one of the old Apple IIs, sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars in recent times, just because it was very rare. And this just goes to show that people desire things that are hard to get or are very rare, and this is just an unconscious effect on the human mind, because human beings don't want to lose opportunities, and human beings are very sensitive to losing something, even though that thing might not be very valuable at the end. So that is my summary to influence. I would also like to add that Cialdini writes in a very engaging and entertaining way. He's quite a humorous guy and cracks jokes every now and then, and generally just makes the book a very enjoyable read, in addition to providing a lot of useful information. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to read the book yourself, there's an Amazon link in the description, so click on the link and buy the book if you would like to read it yourself. Also, follow me on Instagram for more content, and follow me on Medium and Goodreads. Medium is where I write more detailed essays on the books I read, and Goodreads is where I rate a lot of the books I read. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.